It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
"Hand over the keys, Margaret," Richard Henderson snapped, his voice slicing through the hushed elegance of the country club's Sunday brunch. The dining room, a sea of white linen and polished silver, went momentarily still. Margaret Sullivan didn't flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her cup, the scent of oversteeped Earl Grey clashing with the heavy, expensive cologne Richard favored. She could feel the eyes of the table next to them, the Millers and the Whittakers, pricking at her skin. They were the very people Richard spent his life trying to impress, and now they were watching him dismantle his mother-in-law's dignity with the same clinical precision he'd once used to gut companies. "The house is too much for you, and we've already discussed the transition to the Shady Oaks suite," Richard continued, his tone shifting into that terrifyingly smooth CFO voice he used when he was manufacturing a reality. He adjusted his silk blue tie, the fabric shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. "It's for your own safety. You're becoming forgetful. Isn't that right, Jennifer?" Jennifer Henderson, Margaret's daughter, flinched as if struck. She looked at her mother, her eyes swimming with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. "Richard, maybe this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," he interrupted, leaning forward so his shadow fell across Margaret's plate. "I've already signed the preliminary management forms. All I need is the spare set of keys you keep in your purse and your signature on the power of attorney. You're a retired nurse, Margaret. You know how these things go. The body fails, the mind follows. It's better to do this while there's still a shred of grace left." Margaret finally looked up. Her clinical eyes, sharpened by 40 years of triaging the dying and the desperate, swept over him. She didn't see a powerful executive. She saw a man whose pupils were slightly dilated, whose hand had a microscopic tremor as he gripped his champagne flute, and whose expensive suit couldn't hide the frantic tension in his jaw. Richard wasn't just being cruel, he was in a hurry. "I'm not forgetful, Richard," she said, her voice a calm, low anchor in the middle of his storm. "In fact, my memory is quite vivid. For instance, I remember that the house you're so eager to manage was bought with my late husband's life insurance and my own pension. It is not an asset of Henderson Holdings." A dry, sharp laugh escaped him. He signaled the waiter, a young man who looked like he wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. "Check, please. My mother-in-law is having one of her episodes." It's so tragic when the confusion sets in so publicly. The humiliation was a physical weight, thick as the humidity outside. Margaret saw Lily, her 12-year-old granddaughter, sitting at the end of the table. The girl's face was pale, but her thumbs were moving rapidly over the screen of her phone, hidden beneath the tablecloth. Lily caught Margaret's eye and gave a single, imperceptible nod. "You think you're being clever," Richard whispered, leaning in closer so only the family could hear, his breath smelling of mimosa and arrogance. "But you're just an old woman in a drafty house you can't afford to heat. By the end of the month, I'll have those locks changed. I've already diverted the tax assessments to my office. You're a guest in your own life now, Margaret. Act like a grateful one." He stood up, tossing a $100 bill onto the table as if the gesture could erase the stench of his behavior. He didn't wait for them. He strode toward the exit, his head held high, radiating the confidence of a man who believed the world was a series of balance sheets he could always manipulate. Jennifer rose to follow him, her shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry, Mom. He's just stressed about the audit at the firm. He doesn't mean it." "He means every word, Jennifer," Margaret said, her voice steady. "And so do I." As her daughter hurried away, Margaret remained in her chair. She reached into her modest handbag, her fingers brushing against a small, digital voice recorder and a folded slip of paper. A printout of a private ledger she'd found tucked inside an old medical journal Richard had mistakenly left in her guest room months ago. She felt the cool porcelain of the cold coffee cup. Richard thought he was playing a game of power and status, but he had forgotten one fundamental truth. Margaret Sullivan had spent 4 decades watching people at their worst. She knew how to spot a wound that was festering beneath a clean bandage. She pulled out her phone and sent a short text to a number she had saved under Miss Chen. "The lion is awake. Proceed with the first filing." Margaret stood up, smoothing her sensible wool skirt. She didn't look like a woman who had just been publicly stripped of her autonomy. She looked like a woman who was about to perform a very delicate, very necessary surgery. As she walked past the miller's table, she paused and smiled at them, a genuine, warm nurse's smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Enjoy the brunch," she said softly. "The salmon is excellent, though I find the company in this room is about to become much more interesting." She walked out of the club, the heavy oak doors closing behind her with a sound like a gavel. The countdown had begun, and Richard Henderson had no idea that the forgetful woman he'd just insulted was the only person who knew exactly where all his bodies were buried. The next morning, the sun bled through the heavy velvet curtains of the Henderson estate, but the light felt clinical, like a spotlight in an operating room. Richard Henderson sat at the head of the mahogany breakfast table, the scent of bitter espresso and expensive leather upholstery clinging to him like a second skin. He didn't look up when Margaret Sullivan entered the room. He was too busy tapping a silver fountain pen against a stack of legal documents, the rhythmic asterisk click 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 asterisk sounding like a countdown. "You're late, Margaret," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. He finally glanced up, his eyes raking over her sensible cardigan with a sneer. "Then again, I suppose we should get used to your tardiness. The doctor said memory lapses often start with a distorted sense of time." Jennifer Henderson sat across from him, her knuckles white as she gripped her porcelain cup. "Richard, stop it. She's right here." "Exactly. She's right here, and yet she's clearly not all there," he countered, sliding a paper toward Jennifer. "I've already spoken with Mr. Harrison. We're moving the hearing up. If she can't remember to bring the right wine to a brunch, she certainly can't be trusted with the Sullivan Trust's oversight. It's for her own protection." Margaret felt the cold weight of the flash drive in her pocket, its metal edge pressing against her thigh. She didn't flinch. Instead, she moved to the sideboard, the sound of her soft-soled shoes muffled by the Persian rug. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, the steam rising in a bitter cloud. "I remember the wine perfectly, Richard," she said quietly, her back to him. "It was a 1982 Petrus. You bought it with the money you borrowed from the estate's maintenance fund 3 years ago. The one you told the auditors was spent on roof repairs." The clicking of the pen stopped. The silence in the room was sudden and suffocating. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry purple, the color of a bruised plum. He stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the hardwood. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're confused again." He turned to Jennifer, his voice rising in a calculated display of performative concern. "See, this is exactly what I mean. Paranoia, delusions of persecution. It's heartbreaking, really." He stepped closer to Margaret, invading her space until she could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. "You're a retired nurse, Margaret. You should know the signs. You're sunsetting. It's time to let the professionals handle the heavy lifting." Margaret turned slowly, meeting his gaze with a clarity that seemed to catch him off guard. She didn't see a powerful CFO. She saw a patient with a failing heart and a bloated ego. "I've spent 40 years watching people think they're invincible right up until the monitor flatlines. Richard, you'd be surprised how much a confused woman can see when she's spent her life observing symptoms." She walked past him, pausing only to pat Jennifer's hand. Lily Henderson was standing in the doorway, her smartphone held low against her leg, the small green light of the camera lens glowing like a predator's eye. The girl didn't say a word, but the slight nod she gave Margaret was enough. The evidence was mounting. An hour later, Margaret sat in a glass-walled office downtown. The air here smelled of ozone and fresh ink. Miss Chen sat across from her, flipping through a digital file with the practiced efficiency of a shark circling a reef. "He's filed for emergency temporary guardianship," the attorney said, her voice crisp. "He's citing the brunch incident and 3 other fabricated lapses. He wants total control of your assets by Friday." Margaret leaned back, the leather chair creaking. "And the property deed." Miss Chen smiled, a sharp, cold expression. "That's the beauty of it. Richard Henderson thinks he inherited this estate from his father. He's been using it as collateral for his private equity gambles for a decade. But your father never transferred the title to the Henderson line. He placed it in a life estate for you, with a reversionary interest that Richard's name has never touched. Legally, he's been trespassing on your land for 40 years. Margaret looked out the window at the city skyline. She felt a strange, detached sense of calm. The rage was there, but it was directed, a steady current powering a machine. "He's throwing a legacy gala in 3 days," she said softly. "He invited the board, the press, and Judge Morrison. He wants to announce his philanthropic takeover of my family's foundation." 3 days, Miss Chen mused, tapping a rhythm on her tablet that matched the one Richard had used earlier. "That should be just enough time for the first filing to hit the public record." Margaret stood up, her sensible wool skirt falling perfectly into place. She felt the power of the secret shifting in her chest, a dormant volcano finally beginning to smoke. Richard thought he was preparing a throne. He was actually building a scaffold. "Let him have his party," Margaret said, her voice like grinding stones. "I want everyone to see him when the floor gives way." As she left the office, her phone buzzed. It was a calendar alert. 72 hours remaining. The countdown wasn't just in her head anymore, it was on the clock, and Richard Henderson had no idea that the woman he called a broken clock was the one who had finally wound the spring. 2 days later, the air in Miss Chen's office felt thinner, charged with the clinical scent of peppermint tea and the dry, metallic tang of a high-end laser printer. Margaret Sullivan sat perfectly still, her spine a rigid line against the ergonomic chair that felt far too modern for her tastes. Across the mahogany desk, the attorney slid a single manila folder forward. It looked unassuming, but to the woman who had spent 40 years charting heart rates and blood pressures, it possessed the heavy, unmistakable weight of a terminal diagnosis. "The 1998 codicil," Miss Chen said, her voice like a scalpel. "The one Richard Henderson claimed gave him the authority to merge the Sullivan Foundation with his own holdings. I've had 3 forensic document examiners look at the digital scans Lily provided from his private safe." Margaret didn't need to ask. She felt the secret power of the truth warming her chest, a stark contrast to the air conditioning humming overhead. She reached out, her fingers grazing the cool, smooth paper. "It's a forgery, isn't it?" "A sophisticated one," the lawyer replied, leaning back. "He lifted your signature from a 1996 hospital gala program, but he made one fatal mistake. The ink profile on the original document, which we've now tracked to the archives of the county clerk, contains a chemical stabilizer that didn't exist until 2004. He backdated a lie, Margaret. He's been sitting on a house of cards for over a decade." The older woman closed her eyes for a brief second. She could almost hear the ticking of the clock Richard thought he had wound. He wasn't just an arrogant man. He was a thief who had stolen her father's legacy and rebranded it with his own vanity. She tucked the folder into her sensible leather handbag, the snap of the brass latch echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. 48 hours, she murmured. 48 hours, Miss Chen confirmed. "Mr. Harrison has already filed the preliminary merger papers with the court, thinking it's a formality. He has no idea we're about to file a motion for immediate stay based on criminal fraud." When Margaret returned to the Henderson estate that afternoon, the house was a hive of frantic, expensive activity. The sound of heavy crates being dragged across the marble foyer grated against her nerves. Florists were hauling in dozens of white lilies, their cloying, funeral sweet scent thick enough to choke on. At the center of the chaos stood Richard, looking every bit the conquering hero in a tailored navy blazer. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, the ice clinking rhythmically against the glass as he gestured toward the grand staircase. "Move those arrangements to the left," he barked at a trembling assistant. He turned as he saw his mother-in-law enter, his eyes narrowing with a look of practiced pity. "Ah, Margaret, you're back. I was just telling Jennifer that we should probably have your dinner sent up to your room for the next 2 nights. With the press and the board members arriving for the rehearsal, the house is going to be far too loud for someone in your delicate state." The audacity of his tone was a physical weight. He spoke to her as if she were a piece of furniture that no longer fit the decor. "I'm feeling quite robust, actually, Richard," she said, her voice steady. He laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that made the florists pause. He stepped closer, the smell of expensive peat and arrogance radiating off him. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Don't be difficult. I've already drafted the press release for the merger. It mentions your voluntary retirement due to cognitive decline. It's a graceful exit, Margaret. If you try to speak at the podium, I'll simply have Jennifer explain that you've had another episode. Do you understand?" The rage spike was sharp and hot, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. Instead, she felt the edge of the folder inside her bag. Wait for it, she thought, just wait. "I understand perfectly," she replied. "Good." He patted her arm with a condescending heaviness. "Mr. Harrison is in the library finalizing the last of the Sullivan assets transfer. Why don't you go find Lily? The girl has been glued to her laptop all day. She's becoming as morose as you are." Margaret walked past him, her head held high. She found Jennifer in the kitchen, looking frayed as she stared at a seating chart. Her daughter's hands were shaking as she moved a name card. "He wants to put you at the back table, Mom," Jennifer whispered, her eyes brimming with a mixture of shame and exhaustion. "Next to the catering staff. He said it's so you can slip out easily if you get tired, but we both know what he's doing." "Let him," Margaret said, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. She felt the tension in Jennifer's muscles, the years of being told she wasn't enough by a man who had built a throne on a foundation of lies. "He's spent a lot of money on this party, hasn't he?" "Millions," Jennifer sighed. "He's even invited Judge Morrison. He says he wants the judiciary to witness the birth of a new era in philanthropy." Margaret looked out the window toward the garden, where a massive white tent was being erected. It looked like a giant shroud. Richard was out there now, pointing at the grass, demanding perfection from people he would never acknowledge as equals. He had no idea that the very judge he had invited was the one who would eventually sign his committal to a much smaller, much colder room. "It will be a night to remember," Margaret said softly. She reached into her bag and touched the cold, metallic casing of the flash drive Lily had prepared, a digital backup of every forged signature, every diverted fund, and every lie Richard had ever told. She could wait 48 more hours. She had waited 20 years for the wind to change. She could survive 2 more days of his shadows. As she climbed the stairs, she heard Richard's voice booming from the foyer again, mocking the caterer's accent. He was at the peak of his power, draped in the silk of his own delusions. He thought he was preparing a coronation. Margaret Sullivan knew better. She was the one holding the match, and the floor was already soaked in gasoline. The following morning, the Henderson estate smelled of floor wax and forced elegance. Margaret Sullivan stood in the shadows of the gallery, watching the frantic ballet of caterers and decorators. It was less than 24 hours until the anniversary gala, and the air was thick with the cloying, suffocating scent of 300 white lilies that had just been delivered. Richard Henderson stood in the center of the foyer, his voice cutting through the hum of activity like a serrated blade. He was currently berating a young woman from the floral company, his face a mottled shade of purple. He grabbed a crystal vase, tilting it so violently that water splashed onto the girl's sensible shoes. "I told you the calla lilies were for the dining room, not the vestibule," he barked, his finger nearly touching the girl's nose. "Is the concept of a floor plan too complex for your meager salary to comprehend? If these aren't moved in 10 minutes, I'm calling your manager and ensuring you're looking for a new job by sunset." The girl's lower lip trembled. She nodded frantically, clutching her clipboard to her chest as she scurried away. Richard adjusted his silk tie, a smirk of pure, unadulterated satisfaction playing on his lips. He thrived on the fear of people who couldn't fight back. He turned, catching sight of his wife on the landing. "Margaret, tell the kitchen the 1996 vintage stays in the cellar," he called out, his tone shifting from rage to a dismissive, casual command. "We'll serve the 2005. Most of these idiots won't know the difference, and I'm not wasting the good stuff on Jennifer's little friends." Jennifer's friends are our guests, Richard, she said quietly, her hand resting on the cool marble of the banister. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. They're witnesses, Margaret. There's a difference. Now go be useful. Make sure the seating chart hasn't been mangled again. She didn't move. Instead, she descended the stairs slowly, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. She felt a strange, detached calm. In her pocket, her phone vibrated, a single pulse. It was a text from Miss Chen. The forensic audit is complete. The judge has the preliminary brief. Margaret stopped 3 feet from him. She could smell the expensive scotch he'd clearly started on an hour ago, despite it being barely noon. You should be careful, Richard. Sometimes the things we hide have a way of surfacing when the light is brightest, especially when the guest list includes people who value the law over friendship. He narrowed his eyes, his arrogance acting as a shield against the truth. What is that supposed to mean? If you're talking about Judge Morrison, don't be absurd. We've played golf together for a decade. He knows how the world works. He knows that men like me are the ones who keep this city's heart beating. Even hearts can fail when the pressure gets too high, she replied, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. Richard stepped into her personal space, his shadow looming over her. You've spent too many years in hospital wards, Margaret. You've developed a flair for the dramatic. You're ornamental in this house, remember that. You provide the backdrop, I provide the life. Don't start thinking your cryptic little warnings carry any weight. You have nothing without me. No status, no home, and certainly no voice that anyone cares to hear. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. Tomorrow night is my coronation. I've spent 40 years building this legacy, and I won't have a bored housewife whispering ghost stories in my ear. Go find Jennifer and Lily. Try to look like you belong in a house of this caliber. He turned his back on her, already shouting for the estate manager. He was so consumed by the image of his own power that he couldn't see the cracks forming in the foundation. He didn't notice Lily Henderson standing in the darkened doorway of the library, her tablet raised, capturing the tail end of his tirade. Margaret watched him walk away, his gait heavy with the misplaced confidence of a man who thought he had already won. She reached into her sweater pocket and touched the small, cold metal of a different flash drive, the one Lily had encrypted this morning. Tomorrow, the lilies would still be white, but the reputation Richard had spent a lifetime polishing would be stained beyond repair. He had ignored the warning. He had dismissed the only person who knew exactly where the bodies were buried because he couldn't imagine a world where she would dare to pick up a shovel. She looked at the grand clock in the hallway. The pendulum swung with a heavy, rhythmic thud. 23 hours. The stage was set. The witnesses were invited, and Richard Henderson had no idea that he was the one who had handed her the match. The evening arrived with a heavy, humid heat that seemed to cling to the marble pillars of the Henderson estate. Margaret Sullivan stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the guest suite, smoothing the front of a navy silk gown that had seen better days. It was a stark contrast to the opulence dripping from every corner of the house, but she wore it like armor. She could hear the muffled vibration of a string quartet tuning their instruments in the ballroom below, a rhythmic hum that felt like a countdown. The door swung open without a knock. Richard Henderson stepped inside, the scent of expensive sandalwood cologne and aged scotch preceding him. He looked every bit the retired CFO in his bespoke tuxedo, his silver hair slicked back with practiced precision. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her neckline, his lip curling in a familiar, jagged sneer. "You're wearing those pearls again," he asked, his voice vibrating with a casual cruelty that always felt like a physical weight. "They look like something a schoolteacher would wear to a funeral. I told you to wear the Cartier set I bought for the anniversary." "The Cartier set is in the safe, Richard," she replied, her voice a clinical tether to her own sanity. "These belong to my mother. I prefer them." He stepped closer, invading her space until she could see the broken capillaries in his cheeks. "Your preferences are irrelevant tonight. This gala is about the Henderson legacy. It's about the foundation. I won't have you looking like a charity case while I'm trying to secure the board's vote for the expansion. Change them or stay in here until the dinner service. I don't want you embarrassing me in front of the governor." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned on his heel, his patent leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood as he marched out. Margaret didn't flinch. She reached into her small, beaded clutch and felt the cold, hard edges of the encrypted flash drive. She wasn't a charity case, and she wasn't his prop. She was the one holding the match. 20 minutes later, the ballroom was a sea of shimmering sequins and forced laughter. The air was thick with the cloying scent of 1,000 lilies, Richard's favorite, a flower that always reminded Margaret of the stillness of a hospital morgue. She moved through the crowd, a ghost in navy silk. She spotted Jennifer Henderson near the bar, her daughter's face tight with a tension that mirrored her own. They exchanged a brief, silent nod. The pieces were moving. Richard was at the center of the room, holding court near a towering ice sculpture. He had a crystal tumbler of whiskey in one hand, and his other arm draped possessively over the shoulder of Mr. Harrison. The attorney was laughing at one of Richard's jokes, a sycophantic sound that grated against Margaret's ears. "Ah, there she is," Richard announced as Margaret approached, his voice booming loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby group of donors. He didn't use her name. He never did when there was an audience to impress. "My better half, though looking at that dress, I'd say she's more like my frugal half. Margaret still thinks we're living on a nurse's pension, don't you, dear?" A few people chuckled nervously. The humiliation was calculated, a public stripping of her dignity designed to keep her small. Margaret felt the familiar sting of the rage spike, the heat rising in her chest, but she channeled it into a thin, polite smile. She noticed Judge Morrison standing just a few feet away, sipping a sparkling water. The judge's eyes were sharp, observing the interaction with a professional detachment that Margaret knew would soon turn to fire. "I believe in valuing what is authentic, Richard," Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. "Some things can't be bought, no matter how much one manipulates the ledgers." Richard's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger flickering behind his polished mask. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only those closest could hear. "Watch your tongue, Margaret. You're here to smile and look grateful. Don't forget who pays for the roof over your head." He turned back to the group, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. "She's a bit tired. The excitement of the gala, you understand." Margaret backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found Lily Henderson tucked into a corner behind a large fern, a tablet hidden beneath a stack of programs. The 12-year-old's fingers were flying across the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Is the feed live?" Margaret whispered. Lily looked up, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "The internal server is bypassed. As soon as he starts the keynote and the lights dim for the presentation, I'll swap the source. Everyone in this room and everyone watching the live stream will see exactly what's on that drive." "And Miss Chen?" "She's in the foyer," Lily said, nodding toward the entrance. "She has the hard copies for the judge. She's just waiting for the signal." Margaret looked back at the podium. Richard was stepping up to the microphone, the spotlight catching the silver in his hair, making him look like the statesman he pretended to be. He tapped the mic, the sound echoing through the hall like a gavel. The room began to quiet, the guests turning their attention toward the man they thought was their benefactor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Tonight is about more than just wealth. It's about the integrity of the Henderson name. It's about the truth of what we've built together." Margaret moved toward the side of the stage, her hand gripping the edge of her clutch. She caught Judge Morrison's eye. The judge looked at her, then at the screen behind Richard, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The tension in the room was a physical thing now, a coiled spring ready to snap. Richard gestured toward the large projection screen behind him. "Before we begin the auction, I'd like to share a short presentation on the legacy of our firm. A look at the transparency and honor that defines us." He clicked the remote in his hand. Margaret saw Lily's thumb hover over the enter key. The wait for it moment stretched, the air in the ballroom suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. Richard smiled at the crowd, his chest puffed out with the misplaced confidence of a man who believed his own lies. He had no idea that the transparency he had just promised was about to become his undoing. "Roll the video," Richard commanded, his eyes gleaming with triumph. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered to life. Margaret took a deep breath, the scent of the lilies finally fading as the first slide appeared, not the Henderson logo, but a scanned bank statement with Richard's signature highlighted in red. The stage was set, and the lion was no longer sleeping. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer the respectful hush of an audience. It was the suffocating weight of a tomb. Richard Henderson remained frozen on the stage, the remote control clutched in his hand like a useless plastic toy. Behind him, the massive projection screen didn't show the Henderson family crest or the glossy photos of his corporate triumphs. Instead, it displayed a high-resolution scan of a private offshore ledger, the red-inked signatures of his unauthorized withdrawals glowing under the high-intensity bulbs. Richard clicked the remote again, his thumb stabbing the button with a frantic, rhythmic thud that echoed through the sound system. The screen didn't change. He turned, his shadow cast long and distorted over the evidence of his own fraud. The scent of the lilies, once so cloying and sweet, now seemed to carry the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm. His face underwent a violent transformation. The smug, bronze-tan glow he'd cultivated all evening vanished, replaced by a sickly, curdled gray that made him look 20 years older in an instant. His jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, his bottom lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he couldn't control. The confidence that usually sat behind his eyes like a physical weight evaporated, leaving them wide, bloodshot, and darting frantically around the room as if searching for a trapdoor. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline, carving a glistening path through his expensive foundation, before hanging precariously from the tip of his nose. His chest hitched, his expensive silk tie tightening around a throat that had suddenly forgotten how to swallow. He looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a paper tiger caught in a downpour. "There seems to be a technical difficulty," he stammered, his voice cracking an octave higher than usual. Judge Morrison, seated in the front row, leaned forward. Her silver hair caught the light as her eyes narrowed with the cold, professional precision that had terrified litigators for decades. She didn't look at the screen. She looked directly at the man on the stage. Beside her, Mr. Harrison, Richard's own attorney, slowly set his champagne flute down on the linen tablecloth. He didn't offer a word of defense. He simply adjusted his glasses and shifted his chair 3 inches to the left, physically distancing himself from the man he had represented for years. Jennifer Henderson gripped her mother's hand under the table, her knuckles white. Margaret Sullivan didn't flinch. She felt the cool weight of the tablet Lily Henderson had tucked into her lap, the control center for the truth. Lily's eyes were fixed on her grandfather, her face a mask of grim, youthful justice. The 12-year-old hadn't just switched a file, she had opened a vein. "It's not a glitch, Richard," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the vacuum of the ballroom, it carried to every corner. She stood up slowly, her movements possessing the practiced, clinical calm of a nurse who had seen 1,000 panicked patients. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. A prominent socialite in the third row pulled out her phone, the flashbulb strobing against the darkness as she began to record the collapse. 2 other board members leaned in, their faces twisted in a mixture of horror and predatory curiosity. The wait-for-it moment had arrived, and the room was feasting on it. Richard's eyes finally found Margaret. You did this. You bitter, delusional woman. This is a fabrication, a forgery." "The signatures are yours, Richard. The dates match the months you told me we were tightening our belts so you could pay for the house in the Hamptons," she replied, her tone as steady as a heartbeat. She walked toward the stage, the sound of her sensible heels on the hardwood floor counting down the seconds of his reign. "I spent 40 years letting you believe I wasn't paying attention. I was a nurse. My job was to observe, to record, and to wait for the symptoms to manifest." He reached out as if to grab the screen, to tear the digital truth out of the air, but he tripped over the hem of the heavy velvet curtain. He stumbled, his hands hitting the floor with a dull thud. The mighty CFO was on his knees, bathed in the red light of his own greed. Margaret stopped at the edge of the stage. She didn't look down at him with rage. She looked at him with the cold indifference one might show a broken piece of equipment. "You said I was a burden on the estate, Richard. It's hard to be a burden on money that you've already stolen." She turned her back on him before he could find his breath to respond. She didn't stay to watch him scramble. She didn't stay to hear the murmurs of the crowd turn into a roar of condemnation. She simply walked toward the exit, Jennifer and Lily following in her wake. As she pushed open the heavy oak doors, the cool night air hit her face, smelling of rain and freedom. Behind her, she heard the first shout of fraud and the frantic sound of Richard trying to explain the unexplainable. The lion had finished her hunt, and she didn't need to stay for the scavengers to finish the rest. The cool night air had barely touched Margaret Sullivan's face when the heavy oak doors behind her flew open again, hitting the stone exterior with a bone-jarring thud. She stood on the damp pavement of the valet circle, the scent of wet asphalt and expensive exhaust filling the space. Behind her, the muffled roar of the Gala had turned into a discordant symphony of gasps and shouting. Jennifer gripped her mother's arm, her fingers trembling with a mix of adrenaline and hard-won relief, while Lily stood tall beside them, her thumb hovering over the upload button on her tablet. "Margaret!" The scream was jagged, stripped of the polished CFO veneer Richard Henderson had worn like armor for 40 years. He burst through the doors, his silk tie undone and hanging like a noose around his neck. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. His face was a map of total ruin. The skin, usually a pampered, sun-touched bronze, had curdled into a sickly, mottled gray. His eyes were bloodshot and bulging, darting frantically as if looking for an escape hatch that didn't exist in the physical world. His lower lip trembled uncontrollably, and a bead of cold sweat tracked a path through the expensive foundation he used to hide his age, leaving a smear of pale orange against his frantic, twitching cheek. His shoulders, once squared with unearned pride, had slumped forward, making him look small and hollowed out. The veins in his neck pulsed with a frantic, uneven rhythm, and the confident smirk that had been his trademark was replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "You think you've won?" he spat, stumbling toward them. His shoes skidded on the slick stone. That theater in there, it's hearsay, fabrication. I'll have you in a cell for defamation before the sun comes up. Give me those files, Jennifer, now." He reached out, his fingers clawing at the air, a desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. "I wouldn't advise another step, Richard." The voice was calm, weighted with the absolute gravity of the law. Judge Morrison stepped out from the shadows of the portico, followed closely by Miss Chen. The judge's expression was one of profound distaste, the look a gardener might give a particularly invasive weed. Behind them, Mr. Harrison lingered, his face pale as he looked at his phone, then at his client. "Judge," Richard gasped, his voice cracking. "This woman is unstable. She's been planning this. She's bitter about the estate." "I've seen enough, Richard," Judge Morrison interrupted, his voice like a gavel strike. "I sat in that room and watched a 12-year-old present more forensic evidence of fraud than most prosecutors bring to my bench in a month. Your friends in the city are currently deleting your contact information." Richard turned his head toward his own attorney, his eyes pleading. "Harrison, tell them. Tell them we'll sue. Tell them this is a misunderstanding." Mr. Harrison didn't move toward him. He stayed 2 steps back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Richard, the bank just flagged the offshore transfers Margaret highlighted. The digital trail isn't a path, it's a highway. The board has already held an emergency vote in the hallway. You've been stripped of your titles, effective immediately." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of a car alarm. Margaret watched him, her clinical gaze noting the way his hands shook. She felt the secret power of the night, the knowledge that she had finally lanced the boil. "You always said Jennifer was too soft to handle the family business," Richard growled, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper as he looked at his daughter. "You've ruined everything, all for a mother who doesn't even have a pot to hiss in." Actually, Jennifer said, her voice steady and cold, I'm not the one who's homeless, Richard. The house is in my name. The accounts you thought you were draining were actually being diverted into a trust for Lily 3 weeks ago. You've been spending money that didn't exist. Richard's knees seemed to buckle. He looked at the 3 generations of women standing before him, the nurse he'd dismissed, the daughter he'd bullied, and the granddaughter he'd ignored. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the assumption that women were background noise, and now the silence was deafening. I spent 40 years as a nurse, Richard, Margaret said, her voice a low, surgical hum that cut through his frantic breathing. I've seen bodies reject organs, and I've seen families reject poison. I've spent my life healing people, but I always knew exactly where the rot started. She stepped closer, her heels clicking once on the stone. The smell of his expensive cologne was turning sour with stress sweat. You said I was a burden on your estate, she whispered, loud enough for the witnesses to hear. But it turns out you were just a parasite on mine. We're done here. Margaret didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch the 2 uniformed officers who had just pulled into the Circle step out of their cruiser. She simply turned and walked toward the waiting car Jennifer had summoned. As she settled into the leather seat, she felt the weight of 4 decades of silence finally lift. Behind her, the blue and red lights began to pulse against the white marble of the Gala entrance, illuminating Richard as he stood alone, his hands finally empty. Where to, Mom? Jennifer asked as the car pulled away. Margaret looked out the window, watching the lights of the city blur into a streak of freedom. Somewhere quiet, she said. I think it's time we finally had a peaceful dinner. 6 months had passed since the blue and red lights of the police cruisers had stained the white marble of the Henderson estate. For Margaret Sullivan, those months hadn't just been a passage of time. They had been a slow, rhythmic exhale. The air in her new cottage smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and the damp, honest scent of the garden she tended herself. There were no heavy colognes here, no sharp voices demanding a schedule, and no suffocating expectations of how a CFO's wife should behave. She stood before a large canvas, her hand steady as she applied a wash of cerulean. The silence of the room was a luxury she still treated with reverence. It was a sharp contrast to the life she'd escaped, where every silence had been a weapon Richard Henderson used to signal his displeasure. A soft knock at the studio door broke her concentration. Jennifer Henderson stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She looked lighter than she had in years, the tension that used to pull at the corners of her eyes finally gone. Lily is finishing her homework in the garden, Jennifer said, setting the tea on a small wooden table. She's obsessed with the new digital camera you got her. She says she wants to capture the truth of the light. Margaret smiled, her eyes never leaving the canvas. She always did have a better eye for the truth than the rest of us. I saw Miss Chen this morning, Jennifer continued, her voice dropping an octave. The final liquidation of the estate is complete. After the forensic audit and the restitution for the embezzlement charges, there wasn't much left. Richard had been leveraging his reputation for years, but the books didn't lie once Judge Morrison gave the order to unseal them. Margaret finally set her brush down. She took a sip of the tea, the warmth grounding her. Where is he, Jennifer? A 1-bedroom rental near the interstate, Jennifer replied, a flicker of something like pity crossing her face, though it was quickly replaced by resolve. It's a far cry from the marble foyer. I heard from Mr. Harrison, who, by the way, is no longer representing him, that Richard is struggling with the indignity of public transport. He tried to sue for a larger allowance from the remaining trusts, but the court denied it. They've classified most of his personal assets as proceeds of the fraud he committed against your inheritance. The image of Richard Henderson, a man who once measured his worth by the length of his driveway, sitting on a stained bus seat, was a vivid one. Margaret felt no surge of joy at the thought, only a quiet, clinical sense of balance. The man who had called her a parasite was now living off the very scraps he had tried to deny her. He was alone in a box of a room, with nothing but the echoes of his own arrogance to keep him company. He had lost the audience he so desperately craved. He tried to call Lily, Jennifer added, her brow furrowing. He wanted her to tell the court that he was a loving grandfather to help with his sentencing appeal. She told him she had the recordings of how he spoke to you, and then she hung up. She's not his witness anymore. Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the valley. The victory was absolute, yet it felt heavy. She had her freedom, her name, and the wealth that had been rightfully hers, but she was 70 years old. She had spent 4 decades as a ghost in her own home. That was the cost, the years Richard had stolen with his gaslighting and his cold, calculated cruelty. You could win back a fortune, but you couldn't win back a youth spent in a cage. "Are you okay, Mom?" Jennifer asked, stepping up beside her. "I was just thinking about the house," Margaret whispered. "All those years I spent polishing floors I wasn't allowed to walk on without shoes. I don't miss the house. I don't even miss the person I was when I lived there." "You're not that person anymore," Jennifer said firmly. Margaret looked back at her canvas. It was a landscape of the coast, but the colors were wrong, bold, clashing, and vibrant. It was the work of a woman who was no longer afraid of making a mess. She picked up a palette knife and scraped a jagged line of white across the blue, a scar of light on the water. "No," Margaret agreed, her voice steady and clear. "I'm the woman who survived him." Outside, she could see Lily in the garden, crouching low to photograph a honeybee on a lavender sprig. The girl was focused, her movements precise. She was learning to see the world on her own terms, free from the shadow of a man who believed everything belonged to him. Margaret picked up her brush again. The justice was served, the accounts were settled, and the monster was small and far away. But as she painted, she made sure to include the shadow of the cliffs against the sea, a reminder that while the light was beautiful, it had been earned in the dark. She was free, but she would always carry the weight of the silence she had finally broken. It was a beautiful, bittersweet burden.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.